Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox, and this week we're covering a filmmaker turned vigilante against DEI program who is successfully changing corporate policies, how the outcome of the UK elections will affect compliance and law enforcement, the nuts and bolts of the European AI Act, and Florida man running make that swimming away from cops on his tail. But first, Tom, how has your week been and what is the most interesting development?
Chrissy, I've long been a political junkie. I went to my first state Democratic convention in 1976, and I've just been fascinated with the race for president since we were last together. And it's incredible how much the dynamics have shifted since, I think, Saturday, maybe Friday.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, I'm a political junkie too, and I can't help but being compelled by the whole thing, but mostly about what it will mean for compliance, right? It'd be very interesting come November to do our crystal ball thinking about the DOJ. But between now and then, there is time. So we'll see what happens.
Right. So, Christy, as our listeners will find out in this episode, the articles I chose were really nuts and bolts articles. And I did that for a couple of reasons. I'm sure you, like me, read as much as you can, kind of current events, law review articles, compliance focused articles, then LexisNexis, and there's a wide variety of sources. And of course, for lawyers as well. And I'm a junkie on all of those. And I just thought I wanted to highlight some of those articles for our listeners. I can't remember if we intended this podcast to be current events or nuts and bolts. It's certainly evolved to a lot of fun with current events. So I just wanted to maybe take a deep dive into some articles that caught my attention that I thought were pretty good. And I think, frankly, are helpful to a compliance professional. I'm not sure on our podcast we really do that as much as we could. So with that, my first article is about document retention and U.S. litigation beyond borders. Yeah. Now, I know you have personal experience in that, and I know we're going to lead on that when we get to the end of this segment. But having a document retention policy is not just comply with the IRS. It's not comply with your customers or those you may be doing business with who want to audit you. It's a good business practice. And I would like people to think about, particularly compliance professionals, although this article is focused on the legal side of things, it's going to be equally important in any type of FCPA compliance or other investigation for an international scope. So it all starts with having an internal document retention policy that somebody's looking at. When I was with Halliburton, we had a specific document retention lawyer in our legal department, and that's what he dealt with. Now, this was for basically U.S. focused litigation, but you've had to deal with this in the international context. And I think it's even more important there. One of the points you have articulated is many times the Department of Justice will want things faster or more expeditiously than people like you and I think is reasonable outside the U.S. And so I think it's important to have a robust retention policy that you can point to saying, we are following our internal policy, even if they're saying, hurry up. And then you can show them the steps you are taking to bring those documents back to the United States while maintaining privileges that may exist, such as under GDPR or other national or regional litigations. It all starts with a robust document policy. And now that I say all this, Christy, I've talked myself into saying, if you're a compliance professional and you're in a multinational corporation, you might just want to go ahead and talk to your document retention specialist or your data privacy specialist and think about if the SEC sends a letter or the FBI or DOJ comes knocking, how are you going to respond from the international perspective? It's something as basic, I should say, of something that a corporate law firm deals with. But now that I even say it further, I can't remember the last time I heard a panel presentation on this at a compliance conference. We need to maybe say a few words about this from time to time. Yes, it may be more in the corporate legal, but I think you've had some experience with the DOJ, and we've certainly talked about the need for speed. from Kenneth Polite, have a document retention policy, but be ready to answer these requests from the DOJ. Why don't you maybe share a little bit about your experience with this?
Yeah, first of all, I think being the records retention attorney would make me suicidal. So God bless that guy. 'Cause I think there's basically no other topic more awful than trying to do records retention, but maybe that's just me. But that does not mean it's unimportant. It's absolutely critical. I think that, so I was working in Europe when we were running a really big antitrust case, and we were trying to get the marker, which was going to mean that we were able to get immunity essentially to turn in our friends. And the DOJ was basically running a race for who could get the documents fastest to get that marker. And we were dealing with documents in France and Switzerland where they have blocking statutes. You're just not allowed to just willy-nilly send documents about their people out of the country. There are penalties for that. And basically, the client looked at it and said, I don't care, send them anyway. Waiting for, I think it's the Hague process to go through and to get essentially an impartial arbiter to look at everything and decide what's too broad under US discovery laws, which are much broader than most of the rest of the world's laws, in order to send to the United States, and what privacy protections were we going to use and on. And the answer was just go right now. We don't care. Whatever France is going to do doesn't matter compared to not getting this. So I think that I was in Europe for nearly 9 years, UK and Europe, and it just always really bugged me, the sense that whatever we want to do as the US is what we should be doing. But nevertheless, they have the big penalties, they win.
You have I think, a somewhat disturbing story for us.
Yeah, this one is not cheery. Okay, it comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it frightened me. It's titled "Deere Flashes Diversity Initiatives After Backlash from Conservative Activists." It tells the story of how John Deere, the world's largest seller of farm equipment, would, quote, this is their quote, ensure the absence of socially motivated messages from company mandated training materials and policies unless otherwise required, unquote. So the company bowed to pressure from a conservative filmmaker and activist who's created a campaign against Tractor Supply, which you may have seen. Tractor Supply killed its whole diversity program and very publicly said it's not going to stand by any of those principles. He's now gone after Deere with negative postings on X, including naming individual employees publicly. Deere said it would continue to track and advance diversity in the organization, but would no longer be supporting social or cultural awareness parades, festivals, and events. This filmmaker targeted especially their activities around Pride. The article then goes into detail about the social pressure companies are facing from conservative activists against their diversity and inclusion initiative. Our gentleman filmmaker, he's excited to name his next corporate victim. At the end of the article, he says, just wait, this is coming. He's super psyched to take on whomever it is next. I really feel for Deere in this one. I didn't know this, but the article goes into the history of Deere. So it was founded by a noted slavery abolitionist from the 19th century. And Deere's great-granddaughter, who ran the company for more than 25 years, was a very strong supporter of civil rights, racial integration, social, economic causes, environmental causes. And interestingly, Deere has won the world's most ethical company distinction for 17 years straight. It will be interesting to see if this affects that at all. And it's really troubling. I mean, what are companies to do? We know that there have been these boycotts. We know that there's been this backlash, but this is really strong, like naming individual employees. If you were advising, Tom, a company that's facing this, what would you tell them to do?
First of all, I tell them to get a spine, that this is absolutely ridiculous. It is an attack on our culture and our values, and we will stand for what we have stood for in the past. This individual activist, I do not think, can influence the sales of Deere any more than he could Tractor Supply. This was not a wellspring of support. I cannot believe that, particularly now that I know the history of John Deere and the basic coming from an anti-slavery background, I think Deere really missed the boat here, just as I thought Tractor Supply did. I could care less what this guy says, and I don't think it's going to affect sales one iota. And I think that if people are called out individually, they need to consider litigation or libel and slander claims.
Yeah, it's not a pretty trend, and it's one that I hope changes as soon as possible, because it really does feel a little bit like corporate terrorism, and it's not acceptable in my opinion.
So, Christy, for my next article, I chose an article, and I'm sorry I didn't say it about my first article. This article comes to us from a lawyers from Freshfield, and it's entitled Implementing an Effective Compliance Management System. Now, it's not the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, although it does list some of those individual components, obviously third parties, clawbacks, incentives, whistleblowers, et cetera. But it is, how do you manage this? And what is the effectiveness of your compliance program at the time of offense and at the time of a charging decision? There should be, hopefully, a fair amount of change in your program in between those two. And many companies will use that window to greatly improve their compliance program, hopefully for a lessening of their overall fine and penalty. But the form of the settlement allows companies, I think, a fair amount of room to try to move their compliance program forward. But this article goes further, and this is why I picked this specific article, because they talked about other countries. So they specifically laid out the criteria in the United Kingdom. They laid out the criteria in Germany. And for anyone doing business outside the United States, and obviously subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, if they are in Europe, those are two of the countries they're going to be in. Some do in France. Spain has one. If they're down in South America, obviously the Clean Companies Act. So there's a wide variety of compliance regimes and overall management systems you need to follow, or rather put in place and then follow. So I would hope that compliance professionals could use this as a way to talk to senior executives and the board. They don't have to come in and say, this is our due diligence. This is what we did. This is the tool we used. You don't need that level of specificity. But having the effective management system is a corporate governance issue. So I'd ask compliance professionals to think about corporate governance, how they would justify their response to the need for governance in the area of compliance, and perhaps educate their board or senior management on their roles in, certainly for the board oversight and for management, the management and strategy. So that was the reason I picked this article. Anything that struck you as useful or other in this article?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're keeping the international theme going here, which I always enjoy. So I think it's interesting how the world's prosecutors, regulators have coalesced around what a good compliance system looks like. And as you were listing those three countries, which are noted in the article, I was thinking about Italy 231, which is one of those where the supervisory board, if they've got it in place, they can have mitigation against any kind of fines and penalties based on their compliance program success. So this is not only good governance, but it also is so prophylactic in so many different ways that it's absolutely necessary. And I think I agree with you, Tom, that the more we can say, hey, this is beneficial in so many different ways, we just need to really embrace and support our compliance program and our compliance professionals.
So you had an interesting article about some SEC charges involving Silvergate Capital. What you got for us?
Okay. So, Tom, I'm going to start with my crypto song. I was going to ask if it was okay, but you are not going to stop me. So here we go. My favorite beginning for all of these is C is for crypto, and crypto is for crime. Crypto, 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 you'll do time. Okay. So the article is actually a press release from the Securities and Exchange Commission titled SEC Charges Silvergate Capital Former CEO for Misleading Investors About the Compliance Program. The SEC settled allegations of lying about Silvergate's capital subsidiary, which is called Silvergate Bank, and its fantastic compliance program and strong liquidity positions with respect to its crypto business. This was all unfortunately untrue. It had a unfortunate connection with FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried's firm, that had a spectacular collapse, resulting in SBF, as he's known to his friends, going to jail. So what happened? Silvergate's anti-money laundering and bank secrecy compliance program was so woeful that the SEC called it, quote, it allegedly failed to detect nearly $9 billion in suspicious transfers among FTX and its related entities, unquote. When FTX took a fall, Silvergate told investors, nothing to worry about here. We are well capitalized. except they weren't. And when all was revealed, the stock plummeted to near zero, wiping out billions in market value for investors. The firm will pay a $50 million civil penalty and have a permanent injunction. But one of the reasons I found this one so interesting was there is a chief risk officer there called Kathleen Fraher, and it did not go well for her. So she received a $250,000 fine, permanent injunction, and a 5-year officer and director bar. So, Tom, I thought it was pretty interesting that the chief risk officer faced so much fury in this case. It seems pretty egregious to me, but I'm sure some folks will go out there and say, look, this is risky for risk officers, risky for compliance officers. She was in the prosecution and because she was pretty severely penalized. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Should we be worried? Does this add to the list of ones to worry about? Or is this no, really, you should have done your job better?
I'm one of those who believes that the current rules for prosecuting of compliance and risk officers are not only adequate, but they are just and fair. And basically, the rules are if you're involved in the crime, you will be subject to prosecution. If you are consciously indifferent to information that makes its way to you, you're subject to prosecution. And I don't want to say the last category is negligence because it's clearly not. But if you don't do anything, meaning you don't ask for resources, you don't ask for expertise, you don't have the expertise, and you're just basically a hole in the wall, you're subject to prosecution. I guess I saw the chief risk officer, obviously not compliance, but risk close enough that she was somewhere in categories 1 and 2. I'm not quite sure whether she was part of it or she was consciously indifferent, but I had no problem with the prosecution or the injunction she agreed to. And I think it was at an appropriate level. And I just do not think that the current tripartite test is unreasonable or even unfair. And I know that's a position that others take the opposite to.
Yeah. Yep, it is. But add it to the list because there's definitely a contingency in the profession saying we're all in trouble. It's all going to straight to Hades. But I tend to agree with you that if it's this going out and publicly stating that everything is fine, nothing to see here, when FTX is imploded and you know that's your major partner, it's pretty egregious. But we're talking about banks. Keep talking about certainly the most enforcement when it comes to ephemeral messaging. Tom, you picked up an ephemeral messaging article. What did you see?
So this comes to us from the Forensic Risk Alliance, or FRA. And part of it is sort of a review of the history starting in September of 2022, I think, when we had some $2 billion in fines and penalties, pretty big month for the SEC, and continued enforcement around ephemeral messaging. But they did have one part of the article I really wanted to highlight, and that is under a section called Existing SEC and DOJ Guidance. They listed 5 steps, and I'm just going to read them. Communications policies and procedures: establish a cross-functional group and put policies and procedures in place. 2, training and awareness. Once again, it's not simply having the policies and procedures, it is training your employees on them with regular updates and refresher courses for gatekeepers or others at higher risk. 3, monitor and audit preservation and archiving. Do you check the effectiveness of the policy and procedure as you've trained on it? And have you updated or upgraded your policies and procedures as appropriate? Surveillance and monitoring of communications. There are tools in the marketplace which will allow you to flag potential risk literally in real time, and technologically enabled monitoring gives you that ability. And then finally, it's a continuous improvement cycle. Strengthen prevention and detection measures and loop those findings back into your compliance program. And I read those at some length, Kristy, because it's clear to me that I shouldn't say that. It appears to me that this is a risk. And if it's a risk, it's no different than any other risk. You and I deal with risks day in and day out. Compliance officers deal with risks day in and day out. And what's your risk management protocol? You assess it, you put together a risk management strategy, policies and procedures. You train on those policies and procedures. You implement your strategy. You monitor your strategy and you approve as the monitoring information becomes available to you. It's a process. And that ephemeral messaging, maybe, I don't even think it's different. But I'll assume for the sake of argument that maybe it's different and maybe it's different in China than it is in the United States, but it's still a process and or rather it's a risk. And if it's a risk, we can put it through the risk management process. And so I want compliance professionals not to throw up their hands and say, we can't do this. Yes, you can. And you do it every day. You just do it in a different area of risk. So that was why I cited to this article because I was really appreciated them laying out that process to think through how do you manage the risk of ephemeral messaging? And maybe I was too soapboxy there.
No, I think it was fine. I mean, so I've been watching the other side of this, right? So they went into the detail about the SEC and DOJ's statements, guidance, all of that. But when I look at the DOJ and SEC prosecutions, SEC in particular, they've really focused on banks and they've really focused on situations where the managers were blithely ignoring the rule, talking to their underlings on off-channel communication sources, and really just being pretty blatant in their non-compliance with their own policies. Do you think that's going to shift to lazy, lax enforcement, not doing proper monitoring as opposed to egregious violations? Or is there just so much low-hanging fruit in the egregious violations path? Do you think this will change and be something that more people need to be worried about?
Number one, I did litigation involving traders in the 90s. And back then, every trade was recorded, literally old fashioned cassette recording. And so this is not new. There have been requirements around communication, recordation in the trading industry, in the regulated financial services industry since I've been doing this. And probably they were there before I started doing this. So, one, this whole concept is not a new concept. Number two, the egregious fines we saw from 2022 coming forward almost always were for companies that had policies and procedures in place but didn't follow them. So some of the big banks who got tagged, they had senior managers who were not following their own policies. Whether you call that low-hanging fruit, whether you call that violating your own policies or just stupidity, I don't know which it is, but that was sort of the first 24 months as we move towards September of 2024 of this enforcement. But the point I really want to emphasize is the SEC has to continue to rigorously enforce this because capturing that information is so critical to their review of broker dealers, of traders, of financial services institutions. And if companies are moving to ephemeral messaging and that messaging is not being captured, that takes away a huge stick that the regulators have. So I would expect to see continued robust enforcement. And I don't think it's low hanging fruit. I think it's fruit that the SEC has to go after because they have to get companies to capture these messages so they can review trades if needed.
Do you think that's going to go to companies that aren't in the financial services sector? I think that's really my question is how much risk are non-financial services companies at?
I think they're at high risk. And I would point you to the Trafigura FCPA enforcement action, where the DOJ specifically called out the company for utilizing ephemeral messaging and not capturing that. Now, that is captured in the 2023 update to the evaluation, or I guess the evaluation of corporate compliance program. So the 2023 update to the ECCP. But I would expect to see more of that in non-regulated industries, in public companies, and any other companies that are allowing their employees to use ephemeral messaging. So I think every compliance officer needs to have this on their front part of their radar.
You have been warned, folks. Okay. Continuing with our international theme, my next article takes us over the pond to the UK to find out what the big UK election means for compliance, right? So we've got the outcome of some of these elections already. It's written by my good friend, Jonathan Armstrong, published by Corporate Compliance Insights. Now, as the UK overwhelmingly elected the Labour Party to run the country, New Prime Minister Keir Starmer will undoubtedly change the direction of the country, but exactly what direction will he take when it comes to issues important to the compliance profession? No one knows for sure, but Jonathan Armstrong has some highly informed speculation. Now, to begin with, it is important to note that the new prime minister is the former head of the Crown Prosecution Service. I did not know that. Found that pretty fascinating. The last time the Labour Party was in power, it passed the UK Bribery Act. But by the time that act was ready to be enforced, they were out, the Tories were in, and there has never been a huge amount of prosecutions under that statute. So that may be it's changed now with a bigger focus on it. The government is also keen to look at AI. They're planning to set up a new regulatory innovation office, which will look at the challenges of AI from a regulatory point of view. I love this. They're also likely to focus on modern slavery issues, especially when it comes to focus on China's Xinjiang region and the Uyghur people, which is really exciting because the US has been really pushing Europe in particular. I know Europe and the UK are different to have more focus on prosecution on regulations relating to the fight against modern slavery. So really kudos to that, exciting about that. And Jonathan's article covered a huge range of topics, including the ones I brought up, but also things like privacy, labor law, data protection. What stood out to you most in this article and its predictions?
The thing that stood out the most to me is the new PM, Sir Keir Starmer. And he is a former prosecutor. And so he knows this stuff. And not to say that we have a former prosecutor who's now a candidate for president, but that gives him a knowledge that others don't have. And I think he takes certainly the SFO's job and role very seriously. And I think that it will lead to greater funding for anti-corruption efforts in the United Kingdom. I think the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, will have greater funding as well for their oversight of the regulated industries in the United Kingdom. And I think he understands the fundamental purpose of these laws and how they make Britain a better place to do business, which sounds counterfactual to a Labour Party government. But I think that because of his background, I think he will be, if not leading that effort, certainly supportive of that effort. He has already announced a greater support for Ukraine. That will mean greater sanctions on Russia. I think they're on the EU and the United Kingdom are on their 11th round of sanctions against Russia. And I think those will only increase as Russia continues to try to find ways to evade sanctions. There's been responses from the governments of the West, United States, EU, and the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think that's all right. That's right. Former prosecutors are compliance officer friends in power. So we'll see what happens. Okay. The UK is planning on looking at AI through its regulatory innovation office. But since we don't have any federal government AI real focus, what we do have are the state. Tell me about the new development in New York, Tom.
Sure. And so this article comes to us from lawyers from Mayor Brown, and the New York State Department of Financial Services issued a circular letter on AI guidance. Now, for those who don't know, the DFS regulates banks and insurance companies. So we've got specific language here around banks and insurance companies. But Kristy, the DFS has over the past several years, and I want to say 5, 6, 7, 8 years, issued guidance that has been great for regular compliance officers. They did it in the area of data privacy. They did it in the area of cybersecurity, and now they're doing it in the area of AI. And you can simply change financial institutions and insurers to company, and it is a very good guideline for you to think through your governance and risk management of AI. And so I try to cite people to the DFS rules as often as I can. And this one struck me as hugely useful in the area of AI. I mean, they have an entire section on governance, on third party vendors, on transparency, and prohibited uses of AI and fairness principles. So I thought it was an excellent article. Once again, and you're absolutely spot on to call out the lack of overall governance in the United States, none at the federal level. And what are companies going to do. And DFS gives us at least a framework to think about it. Doesn't mean you have to put everything in there, but when the DOJ or rather the Congress finally acts, if you have a plan in place and a program in place, I think you'll be way ahead. And of course, if you're doing business in Europe, we'll have that discussion. But the DFS has been really the first major state regulator to give us AI guidance. And I think it's a welcome addition for every compliance professional. You can just change a couple of words and it will fit right into a non-insurance, non-financial services organization framework.
I remember when you brought up the Colorado version of this, which was a precursor, I think, to the New York one that had a lot of other similarly good information. I can't handle the word AI circular letter because all I imagine is like a frisbee shaped letter that they're kind of throwing around, and it's just a very strange way to say law. There we are. How they do it, I guess. Alrighty, so we switch gears entirely and talk about Gen Z. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're like, I'd
I
rather
have a
not.
Gen Z daughter. So let's rock.
All right. So pop quiz then, Tom, do you know what the Riz is?
I do not. I'm
You,
not that hip.
okay. It's a slang term for charisma. And apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal's article, Gen Z is obsessed with it. This article is titled, Is Riz the Secret to Getting Ahead at Work? Now, believe it or not, the term is so popular, it was crowned the 2023 Word of the Year by the publisher of the Oxford English Dictionary. Pretty cool. The bulk of this article is dedicated to tips that will help you develop your charisma in case it isn't natural to you. So let's go through some of them. This, by the way, this article is outstanding. I'm keeping it. So it's the first thing is to be fascinated by other people. Turns out actually listening when someone else is talking makes them like you. Who knew? Another tip is to write handwritten notes and send them specifically with the address portion written by you. You are also to take notes about the people you talk to so you can follow up with them on their birthday or other life event. Introverts usually at this point say, I'm not into this. If you are an introvert, they have two interesting tips. One of them is to put your hands together in a steeple position to show that you are really listening. The other is to nod your head slowly 3 times to show you're
1, 2,
focusing
3.
on what the person is saying. So this article is really about Gen Z's interest in charisma, and it made me think about the famous story relating to the election in the UK. I had to look up the timeline. It's actually the 1830s. So the story is that a woman dined with both candidates for office, and when she talked about the first person, she said they were clearly the cleverest man in England. And she said the second, who won the election, made her feel like she was the cleverest person in the country. So if you want the Riz, care about others.
So I have 2 comments on this.
Yes.
First of all, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence Others. This is exactly what he said in the 1930s.
That's a great book.
It's still one of the best books you can ever read. But I have another comment. There used to be this person called Compliance Kristy. And Compliance Kristy oozed charisma. I saw Compliance Kristy at performances where she oozed charisma. So it works. Now, I don't want to suggest for one moment there's not a place for introverts. But you know what? An introvert can use these same strategies. You can listen. You can respond. You can make the other people believe that they are the cleverest people in the room. And I think that, I don't want to say what goes around comes around, and I haven't reread Dale Carnegie's book for probably 5 years, but this is exactly what he said. And he was right then and he's right now. And you were right then and you're right now. And it's always good to remember this, whether you call it charisma, whether you call it being a good listener, whether you call it just being a good friend.
Or the Riz.
Or the Riz, as my daughter would say, Dad, you're so out of touch, you're retro, but that's cool too. So there you go.
All righty. What's the future hold when it comes to AI though, Tom? Because we went from New York, we're now going to Europe.
I saved this one for last. It's a group of lawyers from Hunton Andrews Kurth. Andrews Kurth was a longtime Houston firm. So shout out to Andrews Kurth. But it really gave a full description of the EU AI Act. And it talked about territoriality, who it applies to, the material scope, the types of AI systems, there are prohibited systems, there are high risk systems. If you have a prohibited system, that means exactly what it says. It's unacceptable from a fundamental rights perspective. A high risk system are things like biometrics, infrastructure, education, employment. You can have those with the appropriate level of protections in place. And they go through and list what those protections are under a section called Obligations of Providers of High Risk Systems. Transparency, of course, is required. There are some, I don't want to say horrific penalties, but there are some very large penalties, starting with 35 million or 7% of worldwide annual turnover, whichever is higher. If you're a multinational, that's a lot of money. And it comes into force 20 days following publication. Well, when's publication? August 1, 2024. This is here, ladies and gentlemen. If you are playing in this sandbox and you're in the EU, you need to obviously be aware of this. But Kristy, the other reason I wanted to cite this is, what is this going to mean for the users of AI? And I don't pretend to know the answer to that today, but I want compliance professionals to understand, if you are using AI for either the prohibited uses or the high risk uses, you have to have risk management systems in place to protect your company. So I thought it was a very good summary of the law. I hope that, once again, compliance professionals will read this with an eye towards their own company's use of AI.
Man, the EU is ratcheting this stuff up. I mean, GDPR, when it was 2% of global turnover or 4% for egregious violation, the whole world melted down. But now CSDDD is looking higher than that. And this one, 7.5% of global turnover. Holy heaven. There's a lot going on right there, Tom. The fact that it's coming into force in 20 days, so many of the EU laws right now are 2026, enforcement 2027. We're going to see our first report in 22 years. 20 days is very soon. So get your act together, folks. If you haven't done so already, it's definitely time. Is it time?
It's time.
It's time for our good friend, Florida Man. And today, Florida Man really didn't want his girlfriend to see what's on his phone. So much so that he ran away with it, with police chasing him in the water. So this story starts with Florida Man AJ, no last name given, and his girlfriend on a boat near Key West. Two officers from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission came up to the boat to question AJ because they were searching for a similar boat. A little bit of a shame. They weren't actually looking for him, but that changed. The officers noticed several violations with AJ's boat and asked him for his ID. Funnily enough, he said he didn't have one, despite needing to have one to be making the boat move. He became agitated and asked the officers if they were, quote, just out here trying to catch people breaking the law on the water, unquote. Okay, the cop said, yes, obviously we're addressing violations because we're cops and that's what we do. As our Florida man got more and more agitated, the officers found out that he had a warrant out for his arrest. At this point, AJ threatened to jump off the boat and swim away because that's a useful thing to do when a police officer with motorized boats are around. Wait, at this point, AJ's girlfriend got upset and told him to give her the passcode to the phone so she could call his boss or ask for help. AJ refused. His girlfriend kept asking him to unlock the phone. And since he really didn't want to do that, he jumped into the ocean to swim away from his girlfriend and the cop. Trying to swim away was exactly as successful as you'd imagine. Before he reached the shore, he was handcuffed and led out of the water. Millions of people have now watched this video, and in the comments, they were both struck by just how much more upset AJ seemed by his girlfriend's request than the police, with one commenter noting, bro would rather take a felony than let his girl access his phone. Oh, Florida man.
Go Florida Man. I love it.
Yeah. We love our Florida man. Until next time, good luck, Florida man, with everything you're going to do that we're going to report. I'm Kristy Granthart.
And I'm Tom Fox.